The blood pooling on the cabin's warped floorboards didn't bother Ellie. It was the mud he'd tracked in that made her grit her teeth. When you're a widow feeding 2 children on boiled bark and prayers, a dying man isn't a tragedy. He's just another mouth you can't afford. The November wind didn't blow in the Colorado Territory. It scraped. It dragged its teeth across the tin roof of Ellie's cabin, looking for a way in. Ellie swung the dull axe, feeling the shock vibrate up her forearms, settling into the familiar ache in her shoulders. The pine log split with a dry crack, exposing the pale, fragrant wood inside. Ma. Ellie paused, resting the heavy axe head in the frozen dirt. She wiped her nose with the back of a canvas-gloved hand, leaving a streak of soot across her cheek. Roman was running up the incline from the creek bed, his oversized boots belonging to his late father swallowing his calves. He was 9, thin as a whip, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Slow down," Ellie said. Her voice was flat, scraped raw by the cold. "You'll sweat. Sweat freezes." "There's a bear, Ma," Roman panted, stopping a few feet away, pointing back toward the iced-over creek. "Down in the willow scrub. I think it's dead." Ellie frowned. A dead bear meant meat. Meat meant they might survive until January without boiling the leather off their spare harnesses. She grabbed her rifle from where it leaned against the chopping block, a heavy, scarred Sharps rifle. "Stay behind me," she ordered. The descent to the creek was treacherous, the mud frozen into jagged ruts that twisted ankles. The smell of the water was sharp and metallic. Ellie moved quietly, thumb resting near the hammer of the rifle. Through the skeletal branches of the willows, she saw a dark, massive shape half submerged in a snowdrift. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. He lay face down, an enormous bulk wrapped in a thick buffalo hide coat. Ellie lowered the rifle, a bitter taste flooding her mouth. Damn it. A dead man was useless. Worse than useless, he was a problem. She approached him, the snow crunching loudly under her boots. Up close, the smell hit her copper, wet fur, pine needles, and the distinct, sweet stench of rotting flesh. He'd been bleeding for a while. A dark stain crusted the snow beneath his right shoulder. "Is he dead?" Roman whispered, peering around her skirt. Ellie knelt in the mud. She grabbed the heavy shoulder of the buffalo coat and heaved. The man was dead weight, built like a brick house, but she managed to roll him onto his back. His face was a mess of tangled, frost-crusted beard and dirt. His lips were blue. A deep, ugly tear ripped through his buckskin shirt, exposing the raw, inflamed flesh of a gunshot wound high on his chest. Ellie stripped off her glove and pressed 2 calloused fingers against the icy skin of his neck. She waited. There, a thready, weak pulse pushing against her fingertips. She looked at him. She looked at the darkening sky. She looked at her son's hollow cheeks. "Leave him," a pragmatic voice in her head whispered. "You barely have enough flour to make biscuits for a week. He'll die tonight anyway. Take his boots. He won't need them." Her hands moved over the man's coat, checking his pockets. If he had a few coins, she could justify the calories it would take to drag him. Her fingers slipped into a deep inner pocket. They brushed against something heavy, cold, and smooth. She pulled it out. A pocket watch. Solid gold. The metal was intricately engraved, heavy as a stone in her palm. Attached to it was a thick gold chain. Ellie stared at it. It was the most money she had ever held in her life. It was a ticket out of this frozen hell. It was warm meals, a new dress for 6-year-old Sarah, and boots that actually fit Roman. She could take it and walk away. He wouldn't know. The man groaned, a wet, rattling sound in the back of his throat. Ellie swore softly, dropping the watch back into his pocket. She hated herself a little in that moment, hated her lingering conscience, hated the soft part of her that hadn't yet frozen over with the ground. A dead man with a gold watch was a scavenger's prize. A living man with a gold watch owed a debt. She decided to gamble on the debt. "Roman," she said, standing up, "go fetch the canvas tarp from the shed, the one with the brass grommets." It took them 2 hours to get him up the hill. Ellie tied a rope to the grommets of the tarp, rolled his massive bleeding frame onto it, and pulled. Her boots slipped in the mud, her lungs burned. Every muscle in her back screamed, tearing and protesting. Roman pushed from behind, his small face red with exertion. By the time they hauled him onto the small, slanted porch of the cabin, Ellie's hands were bleeding inside her gloves. She didn't feel heroic. She felt furious. She kicked the door open, the hinges screaming in protest, and dragged the dying man across the threshold into the dim, smoky interior of her home. He was in her way now, and he had better not die on her floor. The cabin smelled of lye soap, stale wood smoke, and now the sharp, sickly odor of infection. Ellie pushed a strand of damp, dull brown hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist. She sat on a wobbly wooden stool next to her own bed, the only bed in the cabin. The mountain man took up the entirety of it, his massive frame making the rope-strung mattress sag dangerously close to the floorboards. She had cut away his ruined buckskin shirt with a pair of dull shears. Underneath the rugged exterior, she found another contradiction. The tattered remnants of what used to be an exceedingly fine, imported linen undershirt. Blood and yellow pus had glued the fabric to his skin. "Hold the basin, Sarah," Ellie instructed. 6-year-old Sarah, her blonde braids messy and her dress patched at the elbows, held the tin wash basin with trembling hands. The water inside was boiling hot. Ellie took a rag, dipped it into the scalding water, and pressed it against the man's wound. The man convulsed. His eyes remained shut, but a deep guttural roar tore from his throat. His left arm shot out, a hand the size of a dinner plate locking around Ellie's wrist. His grip was absolute iron. The bones in her arm ground together. Ellie didn't gasp. She didn't plead. She grabbed the heavy iron spoon she used for stirring stew and cracked it hard across his knuckles. "Let go," she snarled. The man flinched, his fingers loosening just enough for her to rip her arm away. She rubbed her bruised wrist, glaring at his fever-flushed face. "I am trying to save your miserable life. Try to break my arm again, and I'll pour the boiling water down your throat." He didn't hear her. The fever had him entirely. He muttered in the delirium, his head tossing side to side on the thin feather pillow. He didn't speak of gold or claims or women. He muttered about ledgers, about shipping lines and interest rates. It was bizarre, hearing this wild, blood-soaked brute whispering about tariffs in the dark of a Colorado winter. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin in snow. For 3 days, Ellie played warden to a dying man. The routine ground her down to dust. She and the children slept on the floor near the stone hearth. The floorboards were relentless, leaching the cold directly into her bones. Every hour, she woke to tend the fire. Every 2 hours, she forced teaspoons of melted snow and clear broth past the man's cracked lips. Her resentment grew like a weed. She hated the way he breathed loud, ragged, taking up all the air in the small room. She hated the sheer volume of wood it took to keep the cabin warm enough so he wouldn't freeze in his fever sweat. She was burning her winter reserves. On the 4th night, the wind died down. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. Ellie sat by the bed, staring at the bottom of the flour barrel across the room. 2 cups left, maybe 3. She looked at the man. His breathing had evened out. The angry red streaks radiating from his shoulder had faded to a dull, bruised purple. The poultice of boiled pine needles and the last of her baking soda had drawn out the infection. He was going to live. Ellie picked up a damp rag and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Without the grime and the frost, his face was stark. Strong jaw, a crooked nose that had clearly been broken more than once, and a scar that hooked through his left eyebrow. He wasn't handsome. He was too rough, too weathered. Like a cliff face, her hand lingered near his temple. Her fingers brushed his hair. Ellie froze. She snatched her hand back, curling her fingers into a fist in her lap. Her chest tightened. She hadn't touched another adult, not with gentleness, since her husband died of cholera 2 years ago. She had been a machine built for survival, a creature of duty and defense. The sudden, brief contact with the warmth of his skin made her acutely aware of her own profound isolation. She didn't like the feeling. It made her feel weak. "Ma?" Roman's voice came from the hearth. He was sitting up in his blankets, holding something in the firelight. "Go to sleep, Roman," she whispered roughly. "I found a pocket inside his coat," Roman said, ignoring her. He stood up and padded over on bare feet. He held out his small hands. Ellie looked down. Resting in Roman's palms were 5 heavy double-eagle gold coins. $20 apiece. $100 in gold. A fortune. Roman, Ellie breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. He's rich, Ma, Roman whispered, staring at the sleeping giant. Are we going to keep it? Ellie stared at the gold. Her mind raced. $100. She could buy flour, a side of beef, new glass for the broken window, medicine. She looked at the man's face. He was a stranger. He had eaten her food, burned her wood, slept in her bed. He owed her. She reached out and took the coins from Roman's hands. The metal was cold. We don't steal, Ellie said, her voice shaking slightly. She didn't sound convincing, even to herself. Put his coat back where you found it. She walked over to the chipped ceramic jar on the mantel where she kept her sewing supplies. She dropped the coins inside. They landed with a heavy, muffled clink. She would give them back when he woke up. Mostly, she told herself, she would give them back. The smell of the cabin shifted sometime before dawn on the 5th morning. The sour, sharp tang of fever sweat that had coated the back of Ellie's throat for days finally evaporated. It was replaced by the mundane, biting reality of their existence. Cold ash, damp wool, and the faint, dusty scent of boiling oats sticking to the bottom of an iron pot. Ellie sat hunched at the scarred wooden table, the only piece of furniture in the room that didn't wobble. She held a thick, rusted needle between her thumb and forefinger, violently stabbing it through the tough, dried-out leather of Roman's left boot. She wrapped the waxed thread around her palm and pulled tight, her knuckles turning a bloodless white. Her hands ached, a deep, bone-weary ache that radiated from her joints up into her shoulders. She was operating on a dangerous deficit of sleep. The edges of her vision blurred with a static haze, and the cold draft seeping through the chinking in the log walls felt like a physical weight pressing against her spine. A dry, scraping sound came from the bed. It wasn't the frantic thrashing of the fever dreams. It was the deliberate shift of heavy muscle against the sagging ropes of the mattress. Ellie didn't look up immediately. Survival out here taught you not to jump at every noise. She maintained her grip on the boot, pushing the dull needle through another layer of stiff leather. She tied off the heavy thread, snipped the end clean with her teeth, and set the boot down. Only then, with a slow, agonizing stiffness in her neck, did she turn her head toward the corner of the room. The mountain man was awake. He didn't gasp. He didn't ask where he was. He lay perfectly still, his massive head turned on the thin feather pillow to face her. His eyes were wide open. They were a startling, pale gray, the exact color of the sky, just before a heavy blizzard broke over the ridge. And they were completely, unnervingly lucid. He was tracking the room. Ellie watched his eyes move, cataloging his environment with the cold calculation of a predator checking the perimeter of a trap. He looked at the heavy iron latch on the door. He noted the scarred Sharp's rifle leaning against the chopping block. He took in the 2 small, blanket-wrapped lumps huddled near the dying embers of the hearth. Finally, his gaze snapped back to her, taking the measure of the tired woman in the frayed dress sitting 10 feet away. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. The only sound was the sporadic pop of a pine knot in the stove and the shallow breathing of the sleeping children. "Where's my coat?" he rasped. His voice was a ruin. It sounded like 2 rough stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry well. Ellie's jaw tightened. She stared at him, feeling a sudden, irrational spike of anger. There was no confusion in his tone. "No, where am I? And certainly no thank you for pulling me out of the frozen mud and saving my miserable life. Just a flat, entitled demand." "Good morning to you too," Ellie said dryly. She didn't bother to soften her voice. She stood up, her stiff knees popping loudly in the quiet cabin, and walked over to the wooden water bucket. She broke the thin layer of ice on the surface with a tin dipper. "Your coat is on the far peg by the door. It smells like a dead animal, so I banned it from my bed." She poured a measure of water into a tin cup and walked back to the bedside, holding it out. He looked at the water, then at her hand. He didn't reach for it. Instead, He planted his left elbow against the mattress and tried to heave himself upright. The moment his chest and shoulder muscles engaged, all the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. A violent tremor racked his heavy frame. He sucked in a sharp, hissing breath through his teeth, his eyes clamping shut as the agony hit him. He collapsed back onto the pillow, a fresh sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He lay there, his chest heaving, his breath hitching in his throat. "You took a .44 caliber bullet to the meat of your shoulder," Ellie stated, her voice entirely devoid of sympathy. She stood over him, the tin cup steady in her hand. It festered deep. "I dug the lead out 3 days ago with a paring knife. You move too much, you're going to tear the stitches. And I am entirely out of clean rags, so I highly suggest you stay flat on your back." He opened his eyes and glared at her, breathing heavily. The sheer indignity of his physical weakness radiated from him in angry, palpable waves. He wasn't a man used to his body failing him. He wasn't a man used to being told what to do by a woman with flour dust on her apron. Finally, his chest stopped heaving quite so hard. He gave a microscopic, jerky nod. "Water," he grunted. "Say please." The gray eyes snapped to hers, flashing with a sudden, dark fury. It was an intimidating look, one that probably made lesser men back down in saloons and boardrooms. But Ellie held his gaze without blinking. She was a starving widow holding a tin cup. She had absolutely nothing left to lose, which made her entirely immune to intimidation. The muscles along his square, stubble-covered jaw ticked as he ground his teeth. He stared at her, weighing his options, fighting a battle with his own pride. "Please," Ellie stepped closer. She slid her free hand behind his neck, her rough calluses catching on the damp, tangled hair at his nape. She lifted his head just an inch off the pillow. He was terrifyingly heavy and brought the rim of the cup to his cracked lips. He drank greedily, with a desperate lack of grace. He emptied the cup in seconds, water spilling down his chin and soaking into the collar of his ruined undershirt. When he finished, Ellie lowered his head and stepped back. He looked exhausted just from the effort of swallowing. "Name," he demanded, his voice marginally smoother now that his throat was wet. "Ellie Higgins. This is my property." She gestured over her shoulder toward the hearth with the empty cup. "That's Roman, and the little one is Sarah. Now, who are you, and who shot you?" "Harrison," he said. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't press for one. He shifted his good arm, resting his hand on his stomach, and it was a misunderstanding over a land deed. Ellie let out a short, humorless breath. "People don't usually shoot each other over misunderstandings, Mr. Harrison. They shoot each other over lies, or they shoot each other over money." A ghost of a smirk played on Harrison's lips, pulling at the scar that hooked through his left eyebrow. "You're a cynical woman, Mrs. Higgins." "I'm a hungry woman. You've been bleeding on my only mattress and burning through my winter firewood for 5 days. I don't have the energy or the calories for pleasantries." She turned her back on him and walked to the iron stove. She picked up a wooden ladle and scooped a portion of the thin, watery oatmeal into a chipped wooden bowl. She walked back to the stool beside his bed and sat down. She scooped up a spoonful of the gray, lumpy paste and held it near his mouth. Harrison looked at the spoon, his nose wrinkled in blatant disgust. "What in God's name is that?" "Breakfast. Eat it. I'd rather eat the leather off my boots." "Suit yourself," Ellie said instantly. She didn't argue. She immediately withdrew the spoon, stood up, and turned to walk away. "I'll throw it out." "Wait." The word was sharp. He swallowed hard, his pride losing out to the hollow ache in his stomach. "I'll eat it." Ellie sat back down without a word. She fed him the oats in heavy silence. He ate mechanically, his jaw working the bland paste, his face set in a permanent grimace. As she fed him, he resumed his assessment. He stared at the frayed, threadbare cuffs of her sleeves. He looked at the deep, bruised bags under her eyes. He was putting the pieces of her poverty together, calculating the exact cost of his presence in her home. "You saved my life," Harrison stated quietly. He looked past her, staring up at the water-stained planks of the ceiling. It wasn't a thank you. It was merely a statement of fact, a piece of data he was logging. "My son found you in the willow scrub. Ellie corrected him, scraping the wooden spoon loudly against the bottom of the bowl to gather the last of the oats. I wanted to leave you for the coyotes. You're too heavy and you eat too much. Harrison turned his head to look at her. The smirk was gone entirely. His eyes were intense, pinning her to the spot. Then why didn't you? Ellie's hands stilled. She thought of the heavy 18-karat gold watch sitting in the pocket of his stinking coat by the door. She thought of the 5 heavy double-eagle gold coins currently hidden inside the chipped ceramic sewing jar on her mantel. The guilt was a cold, sharp stone in her gut, but she forced her face to remain utterly blank. She met his pale gray eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to let him see the compromise in her soul. Because the ground is frozen solid, Ellie lied smoothly, her voice a flat, deadpan drawl. And I don't have a shovel strong enough to bury you. The flour barrel sounded like a coffin lid when Ellie scraped the wooden scoop against the bottom. Shh. A handful of white dust, that was it. She tipped the barrel, tapping the thick oak staves to dislodge the powder clinging to the cracks. It yielded maybe 2 tablespoons more. Ellie stared at the pale mound in her scoop. Her stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting knot that she had learned to ignore for the past week, but her hands betrayed her. They shook. A fine tremor rattled the scoop, dusting the scarred table with the last of their calories. From the bed, a mattress rope creaked. Ellie didn't turn. She carefully dumped the flour into a cracked bowl and picked up the water tin. You're out, Harrison said. His voice was no longer the gravel grind of a dying man. It had smoothed out over the last 9 days into a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the small room. He was sitting up, propped against the log wall, a patchwork quilt draped over his lap. The swelling in his shoulder had gone down, leaving a vicious, puckered knot of scar tissue. I have enough for biscuits, Ellie said, her back to him. She didn't have lard or baking powder. It would be hardtack, flour and water baked on a dry skillet. For the children, Harrison observed. It wasn't a question. You haven't eaten since Tuesday. Ellie slammed the tin cup down. Water sloshed over the rim, pooling on the table. She spun around, her eyes dark and hollow, ringed with exhausted purple shadows. Do not tally my meals in my own house, Mr. Harrison. I know precisely what I have and what I don't. He didn't flinch. He watched her with those infuriatingly calm gray eyes. He had been doing that for days, watching her, cataloging every patch on her skirt, every grimace when she lifted the heavy iron skillet, every time she surreptitiously slipped her portion of dinner onto Roman's plate. I'm not tallying, Ellie. I'm stating a fact. He leaned his head back against the logs. I'm a heavy man. I eat a lot. I ate your winter stores. Now you are starving. We are surviving. Barely. He shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing chest. Bring me my coat. Ellie's jaw locked. You aren't leaving. It's 10 degrees outside and the snow is waist deep. You'd make it 50 yards before you froze to the ground. Bring me the coat, Ellie. The quiet authority in his tone scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. She wanted to throw the boiling water at him. Instead, she marched to the door, yanked the heavy buffalo hide coat from its peg, and hauled it over to the bed. She dropped it on his legs. It smelled of dried mud and old blood. Harrison dug his good hand into the deep side pocket. He rummaged for a moment, his brow furrowing. He pulled out the heavy gold pocket watch. Then he checked the other pocket. His hand stilled. Ellie stopped breathing. He didn't look at her. He felt the lining, his thick fingers moving deliberately. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hand. Empty. The silence in the cabin became absolute. The wind had stopped outside, leaving only the crackle of the wood in the stove. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. She waited for the accusation. Thief, scavenger. She braced herself for the righteous anger of a rich man robbed by the woman who saved him. Harrison looked at the watch in his hand. He popped the heavy gold lid with his thumb. It ticked loudly in the quiet room. Roman, Harrison called out. Roman looked up from the floor, where he was carving a piece of pine bark with a dull whittling knife. Yes, sir? Take this. Harrison held out the watch by its chain. The gold flashed in the firelight. Roman scrambled up, wiping his hands on his trousers, and took the watch tentatively. His eyes were wide. It's heavy. It's 18-karat gold, Harrison said, his eyes finally lifting to meet Ellie's. And the chain. I want you to put your boots on, boy. I saw smoke from a chimney about 3 miles down the creek bend before I got shot. You know the place? Old Man Miller's, Roman nodded. He runs a trading post out of his barn. Good. Take the watch to Miller. Tell him Harrison sent you. Tell him to give you a sled full of provisions. Flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, dried apples, a side of beef if he has it in the ice house. Tell him to keep the watch as collateral. Collateral? Roman asked, stumbling over the word. It means he holds it until I pay him cash, Harrison said. He looked back at Ellie. Her face was a mask of rigid, terrified pride. Go on, boy. Hurry. Roman ran for his coat. Ellie stared at Harrison. Her chest rose and fell in jerky, shallow breaths. She waited until Roman and Sarah were bundled up and out the door, the crunch of their boots fading into the snow, before she spoke. Why didn't you ask where it went? She whispered. Her voice was raspy. Harrison looked down at his ruined hands. Where what went? The money. The gold eagles. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. You know they were in your coat. You checked. I had a lot of things in my coat, Ellie. Don't play games with me, she snapped, stepping closer to the bed. The shame was a hot, physical weight in her stomach. It made her angry. I am not a fool. You know I took them. Harrison sighed. He ran his hand over his thick, unkempt beard. I know you took them. I also know you're boiling tree bark for tea and feeding your children water and flour dust. I know you dragged 220 pounds of dead weight up a frozen hill to save a stranger. He looked up, his pale eyes entirely devoid of judgment. You didn't steal them, Ellie. You collected a toll. The breath punched out of her. The forgiveness was worse than an accusation. It stripped away her armor. She turned on her heel, marched to the mantel, and grabbed the chipped ceramic sewing jar. She brought it to the bed and upended it over the patchwork quilt. Clink, 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 clink. The 5 heavy gold coins tumbled onto the fabric, gleaming dull and heavy. I didn't spend them, Ellie said. Her voice broke on the last word. She swallowed hard, forcing the weakness down. I tried to justify it. I told myself you were dead anyway. Then I told myself you owed us. But I couldn't spend them. It felt like dirt in my hands. Harrison looked at the coins. He didn't touch them. He looked at Ellie's hands, the cracked, bleeding knuckles, the dirt permanently ingrained in the calluses, the blue veins standing out against the pale skin. Slowly, awkwardly, he reached out with his left hand. He didn't reach for the gold. He reached for her. His massive hand wrapped around her wrist. The warmth of his skin seeped instantly into her freezing blood. He pulled, not hard, but with a steady pressure that demanded she step closer. Ellie stiffened, her instinct to pull away warring with a sudden, desperate craving for the contact. She stepped until her knees hit the edge of the mattress. Harrison turned her hand over. He traced the deep, angry split on the pad of her thumb. You're a hard woman, Ellie Higgins, Harrison murmured, his thumb brushing over her pulse point. You'd let yourself starve to death before you compromised your pride. It's a flaw. It's all I have left, she whispered, staring down at their joined hands. Not anymore. Harrison let go of her wrist and picked up the 5 gold coins. He reached out and grabbed her hand again, pressing the coins into her palm and folding her fingers tightly over them. This isn't stolen. It's back pay. For medical services rendered. Ellie tried to pull her hand back. No, I won't be your charity. Harrison's grip tightened. His eyes darkened, the gray turning the color of storm clouds. It isn't charity. Do I look like a man who gives things away? I own railroads, Ellie. I own silver mines in Nevada and timber tracts in Oregon. I pay for what I use. You kept me breathing. You kept my blood in my veins. You think my life is worth $100? He released her hand. Keep it, because when the snow melts, I'm going to owe you a hell of a lot more. The thaw came in early January. It wasn't a gentle melting, but a violent rupture of the ice. The creek roared back to life, brown and furious, tearing chunks of frozen mud from the banks. The cabin roof dripped relentlessly, sounding like a ticking clock marking the end of their isolation. Harrison was standing on the porch. He wore his buffalo coat, patched together by Ellie with heavy waxed thread. He leaned heavily on a crude crutch Roman had carved from a thick hickory branch. He was watching the tree line. Inside the cabin, the smell of frying bacon and boiling coffee filled the air. Roman's trip to Miller's outpost had yielded a sled full of riches. For 3 weeks, they had eaten. The hollows in the children's cheeks had filled out. The frantic, desperate energy in the cabin had been replaced by a cautious, quiet domesticity. Ellie stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She stood beside him, leaving a foot of space between them. She looked at the tree line, too. "They'll be here today," Harrison said, his voice cut through the sound of the rushing water. "Your men?" "My 4 men. I sent a letter with Miller's supply wagon last week." Harrison shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "They'll bring a carriage." Ellie nodded, her face expressionless. She stared at the mud. "Then your debt is paid, Mr. Harrison. You can go back to your trains and your timber." Harrison turned his head to look at her. The winter wind whipped her dull brown hair around her face. Over the last month, the severe, sharp edges of her face had softened. The exhaustion had faded, revealing a stark, resilient beauty that he had found himself watching when she thought he was asleep. "My debt isn't paid," he said quietly. Ellie crossed her arms over her chest, fighting the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "I have flour. I have meat. I have $100 buried in a jar under the floorboards. We are square. I don't leave ledgers unbalanced, Ellie." "I am not a ledger," she snapped, whipping her head to glare at him. The sudden anger flared hot and bright in her chest. "You came in here bleeding and dying. I fixed you. You bought me bacon. It's a transaction. Don't make it something it isn't just to make yourself feel noble. Go back to your life." Harrison dropped the crutch. It clattered loudly against the wooden planks. Before Ellie could react to the sudden movement, he reached out with his good arm. He grabbed her waist and pulled her flush against him. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. He was solid, unyielding, smelling of cold air, pine, and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap she had washed his clothes in. Ellie planted her hands flat against his chest to shove him away, but her arms wouldn't obey. Her palms rested against the heavy wool of his shirt. Beneath it, she could feel the steady, thundering beat of his heart. Harrison looked down at her. The cynical, calculated businessman was gone. In his eyes, she saw the raw, primal hunger of a man who had stared into the dark and found the only light worth keeping. "You think this is noble?" he growled, his voice a low vibration against her chest. "There is nothing noble about me, Ellie. The men who shot me? They didn't shoot me over a misunderstanding. They shot me because I bought this entire valley out from under them." Ellie froze. "What?" "I own it." He let his thumb brush along the curve of her jaw, his touch startlingly gentle against the rough calluses of his hand. "I own the creek. I own the timber. I own the dirt under this cabin. I bought it to run a rail spur straight through the ridge. They tried to kill me for the deed." Ellie stared at him, her mind spinning. "You own my land?" "You never had a deed, Ellie. Your husband squatted here." He saw the panic flare in her eyes and his grip tightened, grounding her. "Listen to me. I own it, and I'm tearing this cabin down." Ellie jerked against his hold, her anger erupting. "You bastard. You ate my food, you slept in my bed, and now you're throwing me out?" "I'm not throwing you out," Harrison said fiercely, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched. "I'm taking you with me." Ellie stopped struggling. She looked up into his eyes, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm building a town here," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "A rail depot. It needs a bank. It needs a hotel. It needs someone to run it, who won't break when the winter gets hard. Someone ruthless enough to pull a dead man out of the snow and check his pockets before she saves his life." A choked, disbelieving laugh tore from Ellie's throat. "You want me to run a hotel?" "I want you to be my partner." Harrison's hand slid from her waist up to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the heavy, messy knot of her hair, in the business, and in the rest of it. I have a mansion in Denver, Ellie. It's huge, and it's warm, and it's completely empty. I don't want to go back to it alone. Ellie stared at the scarred, brutally strong man holding her. She thought of the boiled bark. She thought of the cold floorboards. She thought of the way his massive hand had felt wrapping around hers when he gave her the gold. I don't know how to be a rich man's wife, she whispered, the last of her defenses crumbling, leaving her raw and exposed. I only know how to survive. Harrison leaned down. His lips brushed against hers, a brief, rough contact that sent a jolt of pure heat straight to her core. Then survive with me, he murmured against her mouth. Down in the valley, the sharp, shrill whistle of a steam engine echoed through the trees, signaling the arrival of the carriage. The isolation was over. Ellie didn't look at the trees. She reached up, curling her calloused fingers into the lapels of his heavy buffalo coat, and pulled him down to kiss him back. It wasn't a delicate kiss. It was desperate, bruised, and real. A collision of two survivors, sealing a bargain in the thawing mud of the Wild West. The ledger was balanced, and the debt was paid in full. If you felt the chill of the Colorado winter and the heat of Ellie and Harrison's undeniable bond, don't leave them in the cold. Hit that like button to support gritty, real romance. Share this story with a friend who loves a Wild West drama where survival meets unexpected love. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deeply human stories, fierce protagonists, and romances that fight for every breath. See you in the next tale.
Hi, my name is Olive Anderson, the owner and manager of Silent Frozen Hollow. After watching the video, poor widow and her kids save dying rich mountain man, unaware he will change their lives forever. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the way kindness and resilience showed up in the middle of hardship. Ellie had every reason to focus only on her own family's survival, yet she chose to help a stranger. Watching trust slowly grow between people from very different worlds gave the story a heartfelt and memorable feeling. One lesson I took from this story is that the choices we make during difficult times can shape our future in ways we never expect. What moment stood out to you the most? And if you were in Ellie's position, do you think you would have made the same decision? If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And consider liking or subscribing to Silent Frozen Hollow if you enjoy stories about courage, survival, and unexpected connections.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Poor Widow and her kids saved dying rich mountain man, unaware he will change their lives forever, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the kindness shown when there was no promise of anything in return. The story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can have a lasting impact, even when we have no idea where they might lead. It's also a gentle reminder not to judge people by their circumstances, because everyone carries a story we can't fully see. Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone unexpectedly changed your own life? And which character or moment in this story stayed with you the most? Maybe one lesson we can take into everyday life is to look for simple opportunities to help others, whether it's offering support, encouragement, or just a little time. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and consider liking or subscribing so we can keep exploring meaningful stories together. Thanks for watching.